Hello, folks. Today we are talking about the German ideology. The German ideology was a set of manuscripts that were made by Marx and Engels that were never actually officially published and were later on discovered by Soviet anthropologists in the Soviet Institute of Marx and Engels that would then go on to publish them. They were believed to be written around 1846 and were published officially in 1932. And the German ideology is probably one of the greatest examples of Marxist materialism and dialectical materialism. Historical materialism, dialectical materialism. The main goal of these manuscripts was really for Marx and Engels to bring ideology back down to earth. It's a critique of Hegelianism and German ideology at that time. At that time, what Marx and Engels saw German philosophers as becoming unground from the concrete realities of the world around them, becoming horribly idealistic. And so their goals in making this was to bring back the German philosophers from heaven back down to earth. As Marx and Engels would say of their fellow German philosophers, quote, "The phantoms of their brains have got out of their hands. They, the creators, have bowed down before their creations. Let us liberate them from these chimeras, the ideas, dogmas, imaginary beings under the yoke of which they are pining away." End quote. To Marx and Engels, the socialists within the German philosophical movements had reduced socialism to nothing but a bunch of empty phrases existing in space, with no concrete analysis of the society around them, no concrete actuality in how to change the world, instead, just abstract interpretations. In this work, Marx and Engels would lay down their ideas of dialectical and historical materialism and their materialist conception of history, taking philosophy out of its materialist phase out of its idealist phase into a materialist one. And the battle between idealism and materialism has been a lifelong battle throughout the history of humanity. For most of human history, human philosophical trends and humans have been idealist, whether it was through Greek myths or religious explanations of the world, or through mystical explanations about the goings-on of the universe. But as humanity entered into the scientific revolution, and as humanity entered into the industrial age, for the first time humanity was able to get a new liberating doctrine, materialism. Idealism has always been pushed onto humanity by the rulers of society, by those at the top, because idealism says, well, the reason that I'm here at the top is because I earned this, because of some natural law. During the feudal age, it was the absolute kings. God appointed me the head of this empire. I was ordained by God. During Egyptian times, also, the emperor himself was literally a god. And then during our modern age, liberals, and in liberal idealism, it's I worked hard to be up here as your emperor, right? As your billionaire, as your CEO. Materialism says, no. Man's ideas do not shape the world. The material realities shape the world and man's thoughts, the world around us, economies, human societies, class relations, and so on. And this is a radical idea because it says there is nothing special about a billionaire and why he deserves to be up there. He simply just won a lottery, right? He simply just won a lottery, and that man is, for the most part, a product of his social environment, right? If you were born into poverty, you are going to most likely stay into poverty because you are a result of the social aspects around you. This is radical stuff, materialism. It is why it is the doctrine of the liberation of the working class as opposed to idealism. Liberal idealism right now says that, the world is created from thoughts, right? You have to think like a Democrat, you have to think like a Republican, and then you can overcome the issues of capitalism, right? Somehow, if we get rid of all the migrants, as the Republicans say, we will magically overcome the laws of capitalism. Or as the Democrats say, if everybody can just think like a Hillary Clintonite, we will magically overcome the laws of capitalism. A materialist says, no. The laws of capitalism are hard-baked into the laws of capitalism. The material world is affecting why our governments are acting like this. And so no matter who you elect within that office, we're still going to have a falling rate of profit, as Marx analyzed about economies. We're still going to have a reserve army of labor, as Marx analyzed about is natural to capitalism. And so materialism allows you to both break down the bullshit of class society and also gives you a tool on how to analyze how it came to be this way and how to overthrow it. The authors in this work, Marx and Engels, were directly responding to Hegel and Hegelianism, which argued that ideology, the stuff in one's head, such as concepts and thoughts, were the basis of man's social life. Marx and Engels instead argue that social life is shaped by material circumstances. Forms of consciousness are determined by the material changes around us. In Marxism, man's consciousness is simply just a reflection of the world around him and his interactions with that world. Reality creates ideology. Ideology does not create reality. In this way, Marx and Engels subverted the Hegelian dialectic, which had been the other way around, that idealism, that man's thought is the basis of the universe, and that man's thoughts create the world. And during this time, philosophers were going crazy with this idealism. Some would say that we are existing within the head of God. You can think of René Descartes' great line, "I think, therefore I am." That is pure idealism. René Descartes thought that just because he is able to think, that is the basis of the universe. Marxist, I was about to say Engelist. Marxists say, no. The reason that we know that we exist is because of the material world. If I grab a baking soda and vinegar and I put it into a baking soda volcano, and Abdul in Yemen grabs baking soda and vinegar and puts it into a volcano, they're both going to have the same exact reaction. Through observation of the material world, we know that we exist because the material world is the basis of our reality. And this is the exact same for this material world analysis, the exact same for our economies, for our class relations, for our productive forces, for our technological advancement within our societies. Marx and Engels would say that the biggest issue about Hegelianism was that it made everything within society a religious criticism. That Hegelians assumed that religion was the source of our frameworks and that human society was tied to religious frameworks. Marx and Engels, therefore, were very critical about the state of philosophy that they found Germany in. And that was because young Hegelians were focused purely on ideology and interpreting the world, because their worldview was ideology first as the basis for the world, and they reduced everything else about philosophy to nothing but simply a critique. The goal of Marxism is not only to interpret the world, but to actually change it. And the German ideologists, the German idealists, all they could do was interpret the world. And they had very strange interpretations of the world because they were not connected to the material world. Their interpretations of the world were man's thoughts first, then material world. Historical materialism begins from the perspective of, quote, the existence of living individuals, end quote. Marx and Engels' historical materialism begins from man and his relationship to the environment. To Marx and Engels, the earliest men began to distinguish themselves from animals through the act of production of his own means of subsistence. This means human beings, and what makes human beings special and different from animals is that we have a need to produce things, produce our own goods, produce our own basic necessities. And the most basic first needs of every single human society are housing, roof over our heads, food, and some amenities. Likewise, not only is the productive forces or the technological level of production within a society, are we producing spears and arrows, or are we producing factories, right? Those are productive forces. But also the relations of production are important to how societies function. Relations of production are how these productive forces, how the class relations within these productive forces are organized, how someone produces their means of subsistence in relation to other people around them, right? So are we doing it slave and master? Are we doing it feudal, serf, and nobleman? Are we doing it capitalist and worker? Or are we doing it in a classless socialist society? This is the main basis of human societies, and this is the main basis of historical materialism. We begin from the very inkling. What technological development do we have? How are the technologies and society organized? And how are people organized in relation to each other? These ultimately determine what we dub human nature. If you take a person and you raise them in a slave society, they will act like a slave or a slave owner. If you take a person and you put them in a capitalist society, they will act like a worker or a capitalist. If you take a person and put them in a socialist society, they will act like a socialist. Marx and Engels' great realization was that our behavior is determined by the material society around us. There's nothing, very often idealists under capitalism will individualize the effects of capitalism. They'll say, oh, you're poor, you just didn't work hard enough. That's a fine explanation if we in capitalism only like 15 people were unemployed. But when continually a good percentage of the population remains unemployed, when continually a good percentage of the population remains in poverty, you no longer have an individual uh, an individual reflection of bad behavior. You have a systemic issue. And that was Marx and Engels' great realization. This is how Marx and Engels inverted Hegelianism. Hegelianism saw our behavior as something ephemeral, disconnected from the material world. Marx and Engels, in stark contrast, rooted our actions, our behavior, as something rooted within the material world around us. If somebody grows up in deep poverty, they're more likely to become homeless than not because of the circumstances around them. It's not because of some lack of drive of work ethic within their heads or a personal failing. It's a failure of the system. To Marx and Engels, the earliest division of human labor within society was, quote, the separation of the industrial and the commercial from agricultural labor, and hence the separation of town and country and to the conflict of their interests. To Marx and Engels, the first division of human labor, which was the inkling of class society, was when we got agriculture. Once humanity living in fairly equal societies got agriculture, they were able to produce surpluses. And with the beginning of producing surpluses, that slowly developed into a distinction between urban centers and rural centers. And this separation between town and country is one of the least discussed aspects of the beginning of class distinction in Marxism. I very rarely hear people talk about Marx and Engels' treatment of how ultimately under socialism and communism, the distinction between the rural and the urban centers will disappear as everything gets more equal, equitable development. Marx and Engels then go through how humanity developed and how we got into our current stage of capitalism. Therefore, they used within the German ideology history as a way to analyze the present world and comment and to find their study of history and within it common human repeatable trends, treating human history almost like a science. So for Marx and Engels, like I was saying before, the first human relation was tribal. This form of human society would see small groupings of families with very low technological development. However, along with little to no technological development, they also had little to no classes or division of labor. They would share everything in common with the tribe. Everything was commonly owned, everything was commonly practiced. And this is why communism is described by Marx and Engels, either Marx or Engels or Lenin, I forget who came up with the term, but communism is described as an inversion of the inversion. Because ultimately, the goal of communism is to go back to the relations that we had under tribal forms of human society, where everything was shared commonly, where there was no class society. It is inverting human history back to that original tribal form with all new, highly developed technologies and modes of production, industrial behemoths. However, as humanity developed agriculture, this equitable society would change. In the tribal form, there was some slavery through war and trade with other tribes, but once several tribes get together, we see the formations of the earliest states, a more developed slavery, the distinctions between town and country, and the first private properties through slaves. This comes from human population booms in the tribal period. As it gets to the agricultural stage, which then necessitates things like division of labor, division of mental and physical labor, right? So first you see in the beginnings of these societies, for the first time, you see academics, you see poets, and then you see farmers. And the first forms of private property as the family, which is the basis for the tribe, grows to a point where early class divisions begin to appear, with some becoming slaves and the crudest forms of private property appearing for the first time through those slaves. And while Marx and Engels' anthropology might not be perfect, while their history might not be perfect and limited by their time, a lot of their methods and tools and frameworks are still used to this day within modern-day sociology and anthropology. And their history and their frameworks for history are less about being completely accurate and more of a tool for analyzing how we got into this current position and tools for liberating ourselves. In addition to that, Marx and Engels' anthropology is somewhat recognized. The beginnings of class society and class divisions are taught within every single school, in every single history class, with the beginnings of Mesopotamian society. The division of labor and private property led to the earliest alienation of man from his labor, because man is confined to a narrow field and forced to work involuntarily by the society around him. Because man no longer owns the product of his labor, he becomes an alien to his own daily tasks in the work that he does. As Marx and Engels describe the earliest forms of alienation, which have gone on today to become alienation under capitalism, quote, as activity is not voluntary, but naturally divided, man's own deed becomes an alien power opposed to him, which enslaves him instead of being controlled by him, end quote. And that's what alienation really is. You clock into work every day because you're forced to by the system of capitalism, otherwise you're going to starve to death. You do work to make another man rich. You don't even own the products of your own labor, right? You're at a gas station and you make the gas station owner rich and you don't even own the gas station or benefit from anything of it. You're an alien to the majority of your life. You're an alien working for somebody else, a cog in their machine for the majority of your life, the majority of your waking hours, which is your working life. That's the basic brunt of alienation. And Marx and Engels saw alienation beginning all the way with the beginning of private property and are able to trace how it developed all the way up till capitalism. The state is birthed out of the division of labor and growing classes, with a minority of classes at the top of the new hierarchies needing to maintain their positions at the top. With the beginning of class society, there were rulers and there were the ruled, and the rulers needed to maintain their power at the top. Therefore, all states are reflections of class struggle, and what moves history forward, Marx and Engels acknowledged, was the interaction between these various classes. The slave system then collapsed into the feudal relation out of the graves of the destroyed Roman Empire. And because the productive forces of the Roman Empire were destroyed, feudalism would see humanity retreat to the countryside in small feudal landholdings. Peasants would be tied to the land with a difference between the town and the country. However, feudalism would then begin to decay because of its own internal laws. The separation from town and country would lead to the growth of a merchant class within the cities that would accumulate a tiny bit of capital through extensive trade that was, of course, held back by the feudal relation. But these new merchant classes would want to expand their capital. And since they were held back by the feudal relation, they would move past feudalism. They would begin the first liberal revolutions in order to expand their capital basis, in order to get workers. Because peasants were tied to the land and they were not free and able to be exploited by these new merchant classes in labor, they had to move on from feudalism. Feudalism outlived its usefulness to the expanding merchant classes within the towns. Human economies, therefore, went from tribal to slave mode of production to feudalism to then, once the merchant classes got their way, capitalism. Marx and Engels also highlighted how state and productive relations develop, seeing ideology as being a product not of ephemeral things that come out of nowhere, but being based on reality, the world around them, the economies, material world, and the interactions of people with other people, especially in class relations. These are the basis for our ideologies. Our current interactions with the bourgeois who own the media, the press, our education systems, really do shape our ideologies heavily. As Marx and Engels said, quote, in direct contrast to German philosophy, which descends from heaven to earth, we ascend from earth to heaven. That is to say, we do not set out from what men say, imagine, conceive, nor from men as narrated, thought of, imagined, conceived, in order to arrive at men in flesh. We set out from real, active, and of men. On the basis of their real-life processes, we demonstrate the development of ideological reflexes and echoes of this life process. Therefore, all human ideologies, religions, governments, social relations are products of our material environment around us, especially our base, our economic mode of production. So, religions, governments, social relations, education systems, media, government halls, they all reflect how our class relations are structured, how our economies are structured. In capitalism, they reflect a capitalist mode of production or a capitalist base of society. In feudalism, they project a feudal base of society, and in slavery, they project a feudal base, slave mode base of society. This was in radical stark contrast to what philosophers at the time believed in. They believed in the reverse, the exact reverse. And this is what makes Marxism so powerful as a tool for actually affecting material change in the world, regardless of Marx and Engels' admittedly somewhat outdated anthropological conceptions. Marx and Engels, in order to get a materialist conception of history, started out from the cell of human life and built up from there. For Marx and Engels, history and human ideology began with the first human actions, which were to satisfy humanity's most basic needs: clothing, housing, food in your belly. This is the cell of historical materialism, as it's the most basic driving force of human production and our interaction with the environment and other people. After you get your most immediate needs met, which is hunger, clothing on your back, maybe a roof over your head, you need to get secondary needs. You have space open for secondary needs that aren't needed for your immediate survival. And finally, after man produces the things that he needs for firstly and secondary needs, he begins to spread his ideas and production through interaction with other men. Marx and Engels identified the family structure as the first inkling of the social modes of production, with other people as a basis for creating relations. And through this act of interaction with the physical world to satisfy primary and secondary needs and other human beings, namely beginning with the family, but then other people, human systems of relations emerged. Productive forces and relations of production emerged. Productive forces, again, being the technological advancement of a society, and the relations of production being how they are ordered. For example, horse plows and feudalism, factories and capitalism, slaves and agriculture, soldiers and javelins, etc., etc. You can understand it there. The only way for men to free themselves from the estrangement of alienation is revolution. But in order for communist revolution to happen, Marx and Engels identified two needs. The first being that capitalism drives the vast majority of men to a point of desperation and hopelessness, and two, that the productive forces and the intercourse of the world reach such a point that the entire world becomes interconnected in a global economy. Otherwise, as Marx and Engels say, quote, one, communism could only exist as a local event if the world was not interconnected, and two, the forces of intercourse themselves could not have developed as universal. Hence, intolerable powers, they would have remained homebred, superstitious conditions. Three, each extension of intercourse would abolish local communism, end quote. So what they're basically saying is, we need an interconnected world in order to have communism, and by this they mean full communism, stateless communism. Otherwise, it would get destroyed, basically, by outside forces, or only happen in isolated pockets. We need an interconnected economy, and we need capitalism to reach a point of breaking, basically, is what they're saying. The whole mass of people participating in the overthrow of private property and alienation, which under capitalism has reached new extremes, which human history has never seen before, is what Marx and Engels predicted would be seen. Quote, the destruction of the alien relation between men and what they themselves produce, the power of the relation of supply and demand is dissolved into nothing, and men get exchange, production, the mode of their mutual relation under their own control again, end quote. Marx and Engels then described how under communism there will be a breakdown of divisions of labor. This is full communism, so this is stateless, moneyless, classless society, where man is no longer confined to one sphere of work, and therefore is able to become a fully realized individual, whose products of work are both not alien to him, and who is able to be a fisherman, a hunter, a herder, an intellectual, whatever he wants to be. But is this simply too idealistic and impossible? Marx and Engels answered this clearly. No. Quote, communism is not for us a stable state, which is to be established, an ideal to which reality will have to adjust itself. We call communism the real movement, which abolishes the present state of things, end quote. And that's because in industrialized, highly developed capitalist society, all the tools for building communism already exist. The only thing standing in its way are not the productive forces, the technological advancement that we have. In fact, even since Marx and Engels' time, we've gotten to an absurd amount of productive forces and technological advancement. We have massive AIs and whatnot that could take off immense amounts of hours of work. We have factories that poop out more commodities than man could ever even satisfy and need. So much commodities that they fill landfills. We have produced more than enough food that man could never go hungry again, and yet it fills landfills. The only thing standing between us and this fully realized communism is the relations of production that we have, how human beings interact with each other, and how our classes are set up. And under capitalism, all these productive forces are owned by a tiny 1% called the bourgeois, the rich. And that's why they throw away all these perfectly good commodities into landfills instead of giving them away when they overproduce. That's why they throw away all this perfectly good food into landfills when they overproduce, because these productive forces are not used for social good. They're used for the good of a few individuals. Marx and Engels throughout this text are adamant that for communism to be achieved, what we would dub full communism, it must happen on a world stage. Only then is man able to get rid of the existing order of things. Otherwise, a stateless communist society in an individual area would be crushed by its opponents. That is why almost every single communist country actually calls themselves socialist, ruled by a communist party. For a revolution to happen, the, quote, conditions of life which different generations find in existence decide also whether or not periodically recurring revolutionary convulsion will be strong enough to overthrow the basis of all existing forms. And if these material elements of a complete revolution are not present, namely, on the one hand, the existence of productive forces, and on the other hand, the formation of revolutionary mass, which revolts not only against separate conditions of society up till then, but against the very production of life till then, the total activity of which it is based, then, as far as practical development is concerned, it is absolutely immaterial whether the idea of evolution has been expressed 100 times already, as the history of communism proves, end quote. So basically what Marx and Engels said was you need a certain technological development. You need a certain revolutionary mass of people dissatisfied by the relations of production in order for revolution to happen. Your revolution cannot happen simply because people will it to happen. It has to happen because of the material circumstances, technology, and class relations, and the contradictions of them as such. Marx and Engels in this criticized also how historians viewed history. As previously, historians had focused on individual rulers and kings or ideals of epics as the driving forces of history, something that historians still do to this day. For example, with how the entire history of the USSR or China are simply reduced to the whims of Stalin or Mao. Oh, Stalin and Mao just decided to do this, Stalin and Mao just decided to do that. Individuals, and not the material world, are rulers of the history in liberal historiography. Realities, economies, environment are what actually drive history in the materialist conception of history. In doing so, Marx and Engels would criticize Feuerbach, who was also a Hegelian, that did start the ball rolling on a materialist analysis of the world, but failed in somewhat and fell into idealism, specifically in his religious frameworks. As Marx and Engels would say, quote, for example, Feuerbach sees instead of healthy men in crowd of scrofulous, overworked, and consumptive starvelings. He is compelled to take refuge in the higher perception and in the ideal compensation in the species, and thus to relapse into idealism at the very point where communist materialists see necessity, and at the same time, the condition of a transformation of both industry and social structure. So what he's basically saying is that Feuerbach would abstract from the real world. He would, instead of actually looking at the real world as it was, which was modern-day capitalist society in which people were overworked within factories, he would instead abstract from that and get into an idealistic bubble where he would see men in a higher perception with a compensation of species. And Marxists instead would say, no, look at the world as it is. Look at men as they're overworked, and look at why we need to radically change the world. That's what materialism should be used for, radically changing the world. Marx and Engels would scoff at historians that would think world events like wars and revolutions happen because of idealism. They instead would take the events of history to their materialist conception, saying that the world historical events happen due to the conditions that produce them, such as new machines, technologies, and sudden disruptions in trading routes, spurring wars, and historical movements. Marx and Engels would explain that within every epoch of every society, the ideology of the masses is simply just an expression of the dominant material relations. Within capitalist society, our predominant ideology is the bourgeois ideology. The economy and class relations of a society make up the ideology of the masses of people. So you can see how much the bourgeois, through the news, the media, our education system, get a grip on our minds. As Marx and Engels would say, the quote, the ideas of the ruling class in every epoch are the ruling ideas, i.e., the class, which is the ruling material force of society, is at the same time its ruling intellectual force, end quote. And this is why idealism is so dangerous. The ruling class relies on idealism in order to trap us into their ideologies. Oh, that billionaire worked so hard to get there. Oh, that America was founded on freedom and democracy. And, the American Revolution just happened because George Washington and the founding fathers loved freedom and they had enough with the British tyranny. When you abstract from material reality, such as the American founders being businessmen that needed to separate themselves from Great Britain, and that being the basis of the American Revolution, or, that billionaires are simply just lucky, or either lucky or are products of already elite families and do not earn any of their wealth, but instead skim off the surplus value of their workers, you're suddenly breaking through the idealism. Idealism is meant to lull you into a sense of sleep, like Fox News, CNN, what have you. Revolutionary ideas, therefore, cannot come without a revolutionary class. You have to have the material basis of a class that has certain needs, wants, desires, and contradictions within the system that it needs met through revolution. In addition, another reason that we have idealism is because every single revolutionary class in history needed the masses. The bourgeoisie, when it was breaking out of feudalism, needed the workers on their side in order to break through, in order to have a revolution. The bourgeoisie wasn't strong enough to have a revolution. And so the revolutionary classes, when they need the whole of society to be involved in their process, in order to become a new ruling class, they will universalize their ideals and act as though history happened because of some grand universal ideals like freedom or liberty, rather than concrete reality, in order to win over the masses to their sides. I mean, George Washington was a business owner, but his armies were made out of the working class. And so he had to universalize his ideals of freedom and liberty and justice for all to the working class for a mass appeal in order to actually get his revolution done and for him to become the new ruling class. Ultimately, idealism comes from this phenomenon. The ruling classes push the concept that ideas are the rulers of history, and because it benefits their positions at the top. Idealism focuses more on words than actual material policies. Quote, whilst in ordinary life, every shopkeeper is very well able to distinguish between what somebody professes to be and what he really is, our historians have not yet won even this trivial insight, end quote. Let's now expand on how Marx and Engels saw capitalism being birthed out of feudalism. Within the Middle Ages, landless serfs came to urban centers to sell their labor power. Through this, Marx and Engels found the earliest forms of capital and accumulation. However, because trade networks were so underdeveloped, this capital was not easily exchangeable and usually existed in the form of craftsman tools, local shops, etc., etc. Whenever capital existed, capital being surplus value that you continually reinvest in order to exploit more workers, it was very fixed capital in the form of homes and shops and tools. In addition, labor and peasants were isolated economically, so whenever they tried revolution, they were not going to get very far. However, within feudalism, as the merchant classes began to grow and trade with other towns and vast networks suddenly began to produce things, and specialization within towns came about. Towns could specialize in producing certain commodities and tools and produce things that could be traded from far, far away. The bourgeois and the proletariat of capitalism were thus therefore birthed out of the growing merchant classes, the interchange between towns, and the reproduction of capitalism. And through trade, productive forces of countries, which need a highly developed productive forces in order to transition into another kind of economy, were assured, as before individual machines that were world-changing stayed within isolated economies and could have been destroyed forever. However, now everything was being interchanged, everything was connected to vast trade networks. And it was out of this that movable capital came to be. Movable capital that could be reinvested with workers that sold their labor power to the bourgeois, i.e., the seeds of capitalism were birthed out of the contradictions of feudalism. The baby capitalism that was being birthed out of a dying feudalism would have gasoline poured onto it by the discovery of the New World and the Americas, which would create a world economy, trade wars, and in which a flood of gold and silver would disrupt almost every aspect of the old feudal relations. From this, we would get global capitalism as we know it today, in addition to the global creation of classes like the bourgeois and the proletariat, eroding national barriers, large industrial hubs as urban centers won over in the countrysides, and movable capital. The state, Marx and Engels contend, is a tool of class rule, which, being in an age of capitalism, is, quote, the form of organization which the bourgeois necessarily adopts for both internal and external purposes, for the mutual guarantee of their property and their interests, end quote. And really, Marx and Engels are so right there. Very often the courts, the police, the government institutions, and I won't even say very often, all the time, almost constantly, are used to protect the rich and their interests, the bourgeois and their interests. So rarely are they used to protect me and your interests, the working classes. Maybe once in a while to throw a dog bone to us, but so often politicians and the judges and the police protect factories and not striking workers. And, quote, since the state is the form in which the individuals of a ruling class assert their common interests, and in which the whole civil society of an epoch is epitomized, it follows that in the formation of all communal institutions, the state acts as the intermediary, that these institutions receive a political form. Hence comes about the illusion that law is based on the will, and indeed on the will divorced from its real basis, on free will. Similarly, the theory of law is in its turn reduced to the actual laws, end quote. And this is where libertarianism and anarcho-capitalists get the state wrong, believing that it is simply a negative force on capitalism and not a tool of capitalism and the ruling classes itself, believing that the state is divorced from capitalism and not a part of its process, believing that the state is in some vacuumous, separated force from capitalism and not constantly in reproduction, not constantly in connection with it, not constantly part of the process of capitalism itself, that in fact the state is a reflection of capitalist society, something that libertarians and anarcho-capitalists are completely unable to recognize, that the state is a product of class society and class antagonisms, not something separate from it, not something existing in a vacuumous force that just simply wants to tax you. A highly developed productive forces are important for building socialism and communism, as, quote, only with big industry does the abolition of private property become possible, end quote. This is because only when you reach a level of highly developed productive forces does private property become concentrated and therefore also easily seized by the masses. The masses themselves are alienated under highly developed productive forces and therefore can undo this alienation by seizing the means of production for themselves. Remember, you are working for Jeff Bezos for most of your life, making him rich, not yourself, not even connected to the very work that you do on a daily basis, not even owning it. That drives you crazy. That's kind of alienation, gets to you, man. And the only way to free yourself is by seizing the factory, by seizing it and getting rid of Jeff Bezos through ways that I cannot mention in this podcast. The seeds of socialism and communism are already within the system of capitalism. The seeds of socialism and communism are already here, through the depriving of workers of ownership of their labor, through the concentration of private property, not in slaves or land, but through big industrial machines that can easily be seized by us, making it easily gotten in a way that we could never do before in history, right? Like if you want to have a revolution during slave times, what would you seize? It's so easy right now. We have big monopolistic companies, supply chains that could easily be seized by the workers. And no longer having any isolated economies where a revolution might become isolated and defeated. Socialism and communism wait to be birthed out of capitalism every day, just like capitalism was waiting to be birthed out of feudalism. Communism is one of the world's first materialist movements. It no longer treats the new society as ordained by God or some magical ideological force, but liberates the masses on a recognition that it inherited the material conditions and contradictions of previous generations. Quote, thus, all collisions in history have their origin, according to our view, in the contradiction between the productive forces and the form of intercourse, end quote. I.e., the basis of historical change lies in the difference between technological development and how it is laid out in class relations. Post-scarcity world, still scarcity because of capitalists owning the means of production, things like that. By tracing the history of class relations, Marx and Engels finally arrived to the conclusion that the proletariat, unlike the classes before them which were somewhat entrenched within their systems, are the ultimate alienated creatures, and as a class, are the most revolutionary. Because if the proletariat ever wishes to gain individuality over just being a mass blob within a class society in which they're just cogs within the bourgeois machine making them richer, they will have to, quote, abolish the very condition for their existence hitherto, end quote. This both throws a wrench into arguments that Marxism is anti-individualistic, as Marxism seeks to return the individual to its proper place through class abolition, but also makes the proletariat a uniquely revolutionary class throughout all of history, because past classes such as serfs or slaves either had something to lose within the system, such as land, or had no political power whatsoever. The proletariat, however, has both political power and is alienated from the form of private property to an extreme point never before reached. It is only logical, then, that because of the materialist conception of history and all the material conditions, the inevitable conclusion of the proletariat is revolution. Marx and Engels don't just simply hope that the world will gear towards revolution. They see all of history hitherto and the current development of capitalism, the way it is set up, as making the proletariat uniquely revolutionary, and in fact, inevitably, to some extent, revolutionary, though the revolution still has to be made to happen. It can't just be, you can't just sit by and say, oh, it'll happen. You have to actually actively work for it. Marx and Engels then criticize French and British communists, who also fall into idealism, who also, under the guise of being scientific, actually turned communism into nothing more than a systemic critique, rather than a real movement meant to change the world. As they say, quote, they detach the communist systems, criticism, and phonemical writings from the real movement, of which they are but the expression and the force of them, into an arbitrary connection with German philosophy. They detach the consciousness of certain historically conditioned spheres of life from these spheres and evaluate it in terms of true, absolute, i.e. German philosophical consciousness, end quote. Even though these British and German ideologists call themselves, quote-unquote, true socialists, they were anything but. As Marx and Engels say, quote, true socialism, which claims to be based in science, is in fact actually merely another esoteric science. Its theoretical literature is only for those few who are initiated into the mysteries of the thinking mind. It has lost all revolutionary enthusiasm and proclaims instead a universal love for mankind, end quote. It reminds me of many of today's left-wing communists or other so-called Marxists who turn Marxism into a very idealistic German ideology, bent to interpret the world and never change it, under the guise of them being quote-unquote true communists, whatever that means. Marx and Engels identify these true socialists as rightfully petit bourgeois, who are less interested in actually establishing socialism, but being intellectually superior to everyone else. This is what so many true communists are today. They're more concerned with being right than actually helping people. They're labor aristocrats or mentally petty bourgeois who became Marxists to feel superior, not to actually help people. They became Marxists for all the wrong reasons, of course. Ultimately, Marx and Engels identify true socialists as what they are, idealists. The biggest issue with the so-called true socialists was that they once again used man's brains and ideas as the basis for their analysis of the world instead of the material world around them. And in fact, Marx and Engels would warn that the so-called true socialists with their concepts, such as true property, were actually helping out the bourgeois and giving them fodder, not the workers. Therefore, they insist that communism must always remain revolutionary, not fall into catchphrases of true socialism or quote-unquote true property, as it is essential to resist all phrases which obscure and dilute still further the realization that communism is totally opposed to the existing world order, end quote. Asserting the materialist framework against their German ideology, Marx and Engels make it clear that, quote, it is self-evident that the consciousness will only be the mirror in which nature contemplates the self, end quote, i.e., human thought is just a reflection of the material world around us. And I think this is a very good explanation. While, it obviously lacks some nuances, especially when we get to things like mental illnesses, I do think that, to a large extent, a lot of the mental health crises that we are seeing today are reflections of our waning neoliberal, late-stage capitalist world. And the upticks in depression and suicides and all the horrible effects of mental anxiety and even, to some extent, ADHD are reflections of the material world that is going on around us, which is very brutal capitalism. One of the best metaphors that Marx and Engels use throughout this text in order to highlight the difference between materialism and idealism is their example of the plant. Quote, plant does not demand of nature all the conditions of existence enumerated above. Unless it finds them already present, it never becomes a plant at all. it remains a grain of a seed. Far from demanding anything, the plant is seen to depend utterly upon the actual conditions of its existence, end quote. And I think that's a beautiful explanation for the difference between idealism and materialism. Idealists are seeds planted into the ground saying, I hope for nutrients, I hope for air. Materialists recognize the nutrients and air and sunlight around them and grow accordingly to what's around them, the soil and conditions around them. As they state, we as human beings cannot will things into existence with our ideologies. We cannot pray things into existence as much as it feels nice. We cannot hope things into existence. We cannot, what do the kids do these days? There's a manifest, right? Manifesting. We cannot manifest things into existence. We are reliant on the world around us and how it operates, and therefore our analysis has to be rooted in that. Idealism makes the mistake of basing society not on history and the concrete world and the complex webs of relations these entail, but instead on the individual person. Individualism is the predominant liberal and bourgeois idealist thinking. Marx and Engels reject all of this, instead seeing society as the whole, as the means for the foundation of socialism and communism, not just individuals, their thoughts, etc. Individualism is therefore a remnant of idealism. Marx and Engels would even describe these idealists as people that sat and studied in their idealist versions of the world all day, ignoring the real-world issues around them, such as the town crier. Speaking in humorous tones, they told that these idealists should, quote, present yourself at the Hotel de Ville, and the bourgeois is a thing of the past. You will step up to the police Bourbon, and it will collapse. They essentially highlighted that these idealists had no way to actually overthrow the bourgeoisie, the bourgeois, and affect the real world. They were just simply hoping that they could phrase their way, like socialist and communist phrases their way into overthrowing them. And I think a lot of ideologies fall into that anarchism. I'm sorry to the anarchists listening to this. Writing of the idealist historians and their inability to actually go beyond ideas, Marx and Engels would say that history, quote, becomes a mere succession of ideas and events which are of less interest than the life of any peasant or speculator, end quote. Quoting an idealist historian who believed that social systems were nothing more than, quote, a cascade of thoughts, end quote, Marx and Engels entirely ridiculed these so-called true socialists and their unscientific ideas. In addition, Marx and Engels saw true socialists as engaging in abstraction, idealism, that ignore material reality, such as history, class relations, social struggles. Ultimately, true socialists held on to abstract ideals rather than concrete analysis, which Marx and Engels had to correct. As Marx and Engels would say, quote, or rather, the important thing for true socialists is to foist upon everyone thoughts about human essence and to transform the different stages of socialism into different philosophies of human essence, end quote. Human essence being an abstraction that these Hegelian socialists would do in order to skirt a true concrete analysis of the world. Another excellent quote that highlights their materialism is, quote, man must be viewed in his real historical activity and existence. What manner of man can possibly be deduced from the lobe of his own ear, or from some other feature which distinguishes him from beasts, such as a man contained in himself, like his own pimple? Of course, the discovery that human feeling is human and not animal not only makes all psychological experiments superfluous, but also constitutes the critique of all psychology, end quote. An example of materialism that Marx and Engels bring up is that in order to abolish marriage and gender relations, you have to abolish private property first. The true socialists wanted to just simply get rid of marriage and gender relations without abolishing the mode of production first. Quote, if one assumes religion and politics to be the basis of material living conditions, then it is only natural that everything should amount in the last instance to an investigation of human essence, of man's consciousness himself, end quote. Idealism also serves to protect injustices all throughout the world, because its framework and ideology protect injustice. Materialism is radical. As Marx and Engels would say of Hergern, who was an idealist philosopher who they very heavily shit on throughout this whole manuscript, and honestly, it gets a little boring reading about Hergern and their critiques of Hergern. Honestly, if you're reading German ideology, I would even recommend skipping Hergern, the Hergern sections. Hergern parts are boring, in my opinion, but if you're a completionist, you could. They would say of Hergern forgets further that the bread which is produced today by steam mills was produced earlier by windmills and water mills, and earlier still by hand mills. He forgets that these different methods of production are quite independent of the actual eating of the bread, and that we are faced, therefore, with an historical development of the productive forces. He has no inkling of the fact that these different stages of production involve different relations of production to consumption, different contradictions of the two. It does not occur to him that the particular mode of production, together with a whole set of social conditions based upon it, must be taken into account if we are to understand these contradictions, that they must be changed practically if we are to solve these contradictions. And the idealist philosophers' inability to apply historical materialism led them to justify these injustices. In addition, Marx and Engels would also say, quote, "For the idealist, every movement of the world importance exists only in the head of some chosen being, and the fate of the world depends on whether this head, which has made all the wisdom its own private property, is or is not mortally wounded by some realistic stone before it has had time to make its revelation," end quote. So basically, they would say that idealism just relies on men thinking the right thoughts as the movements of history, right? For Marx and Engels, these idealist philosophers were the snake oil salesmen of ideology, selling fake cures for real problems. In this case, empty ideological phrases and abstractions of the concrete world without any plans to ever change it. Marx and Engels' great realization that runs so counter to our current-day liberal world and our liberal idealist ideology that we're all taught from birth in America and the Western societies and even world society was that claims of divine rights of kings, claims that I'm rich and worked hard to get to this position are all ideological bullshit designed to mask the true material driving forces of class society, that in fact, there's nothing special about the people at the top, nor did they quote-unquote earn it, as they claim. They were simply just the result of class society with those at the top and those at the bottom. At best, maybe lottery winners, at worst, Nepo babies. Stalin would summarize Marx and Engels' points excellently in his volume 1 of Collected Works by Stalin. Well, actually, it wasn't by Stalin who collected them, but the collected volume of Stalin's works, volume 1, he would say, quote, "Socialists were obliged for a long time to wander blindly before they reached social democratic consciousness." Social democratic means communism. Scientific socialism. Here, too, there were many socialists and there was a large labor movement, but they each marched independently of each other, going separate ways. The socialists had no roots among the working population, and consequently, their activities were abstract and futile. The workers, on the other hand, lacked leaders, organizers, and orderly revolts, end quote. Even other materialists like Feuerbach, who was that Hegelian who started the ball rolling for materialism, his materialism still fell short of what Marx and Engels needed, which was to change the world, not simply just analyze it. As they would say, quote, "Philosophers have only interpreted the world differently. The point is to change it," end quote. In addition, Marx and Engels' great critique of Feuerbach was that he would fail to see religion as something connected to the material world, as something that was connected to the processes of the material world around it and a reflection of the material world itself. Feuerbach's materialism saw religion as something that was special and ephemeral and not connected to the material world at all, which was the lingering idealism of his critiques. Though Marx and Engels do give great credence to Feuerbach for continuing materialism and especially advancing Hegelianism into a more materialist phase. And that's The German Ideology by Marx and Engels, which is a wonderful little manuscript that explains the greatest framework I think humanity has ever developed, which is the materialist framework, a true scientific framework, which is the reason why tankies are always right. Because tankies, unlike, I hate to say the word tankies, but communists are always right. That's a much better way to say it. Because unlike liberals who always rely on ideas and ideologies and, abstractions from the real world, communists analyze the world as it is from its material basis and therefore are able to predict repeatable human trends. So that's why we always have the burden of being right. The German Ideology is also so applicable to people that claim to be Marxists today. Left communists, who themselves turn Marxism into nothing but an abstraction and empty phrases, anarchists, what have you, people who refuse to engage within a materialist analysis of the world. This is not a manifesto that claims that pure pragmatism with no analysis of the world is the way forward. No. You need both a good interpretation of the world based in materialism, but also a good theoretical backing, and practice. Practice and theory should always be in a beautiful dance with each other. One should not overtake the other. MAGA communists' great mistake is that they over-rely on pragmatism, right, with no theoretical backing or good interpretation of the world at all. Left communists' mistake is they overly rely on theory with no pragmatism, no material, actual, grounded, concrete analysis of the world, turning communism into these empty, dogmatic phrases that exist in vacuums and are universally applied without any critical thought. Both are the inverse of a bad tendency. The true tendency is to combine these two in the right way, theory and practice, and to get communism done, along with after interpreting the world. And yeah, that's it. Thank you. Have a good one. That was a kiss for you. This episode of the Pokepreet Pod has been brought to you by our generous members on our Patreon. If you'd like to become one of them, go to patreon.com/thepokepreetpod. Thank you.
What the fuck? Glory to Stalin, I barely made it.
And a special shout out to our Marshal of the Soviet Union member, Matthias T. If you'd also like a shout out, please consider subscribing to our Patreon, where you can also get episodes up to a month early. Thank you.